Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name's Jessop. I'm with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I guess I'll re-say that once we're recording. But I wanted to mention, sorry, I'll remember to put my mouth right next to the mic. This session is going to be focused on Mercury. So I'm kind of introducing the topic. I'll talk from a fairly high level about the history of the Sulphur Mercury mine site. I'll then turn it over to Charlie Alpers at the U.S. Geological Survey, who is partnering with the U.S. EPA doing research on the mine site as well as in Clear Lake, and then turn it over to Sergio Valbuena to speak to the effort to really kind of integrate all of this. There's a lot of great work that you're going to hear about. You've already heard some of, you're going to hear throughout the rest of the day today and tomorrow that's being done to study the range of water quality issues that are impacting Clear Lake. And this presentation is sort of connecting the dots, I think, creating the full picture on Mercury. A lot of the other focus will be on invasive species, on harmful algal blooms, and other water quality challenges. But as I'll try to explain, with USGS's help, we're really kind of trying to integrate the efforts of US EPA working on the Superfund site with the Blue Ribbon Committee and the other organizations that are working to improve the water quality issues in Clear Lake. I'm not sure how much more I should say before we're live. Where are we at? We're good, okay. So thank you very much. I wanted to give my appreciation to Angela and the others who helped organize this fantastic symposium. It's a really great opportunity for all of us who are working in the area to really explain to the public all the work that we've put so much into. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here. Thank you. And let me figure out a clicker here. So as I said, I might have said before we were live, my name is Jessop. I'm the remedial project manager overseeing the cleanup of the Sulphur Mercury mine Superfund site. I've had the opportunity to work on the site since about 2017. I've been the lead on the site since 2019. In case you don't know, the mine site is at the terminal end of the Oaks Arm of Clear Lake. The site, the slide here, I'm going to give you an overview of the presentation. I'll talk about the site history, the Superfund program, site contamination, his study of the contamination of the site. I'll then explain the recently selected cleanup plan for the sort of on-land portion of the Superfund site. And then I'll allude to and quickly touch on a range of studies that are ongoing to continue moving the site forward, even after the online cleanup is completed. So as far as site history, it's really important to put this in context. The Sulphur mine was opened on land that had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for at least 14,000 years. The Elam Indian colony is it is part of the Superfund site due to contamination being introduced onto their lands, but the entire site, the entire mine, is on their indigenous lands. The southeast region of Clear Lake surrounding Sulphur Bank is the indigenous territory of Elam and Pomo. So I always want to be sure that we're being really respectful of that through every step of the process. The mining began at the site in 1856. First, they were actually collecting borax and then sulfur, and then they discovered cinnabar ore, mercury. They began underground mining operations and then switched to open pit mining. Mining ran intermittently up through 1957. On site, they also did retorting and processing of the mercury in order to get pure mercury. They collected in flasks and sold off site. Over the course of its about 100 years of operation, they produced nearly 10 million pounds of mercury at a time when it was one of the largest producers of mercury in California. That mercury was largely used for gold mining. It's part of the gold mining process to bind the gold in order to separate it. But it was also used in munitions and for other purposes. Mercury, arsenic, and antimony contaminated waste. Over the course of that operation, mercury, arsenic, and antimony contaminated waste got spread across about 160 acres of the 200 acre mine site. In the images there, you can see underground mining operations is the upper image, and below is Bradley, the last owner operator of the mine site, standing on the edge of the open pit. late in its operations. That's about the maximum depth that the pit was excavated to. So the site was added to the Superfund program, the Superfund list in 1990. Superfund is the sort of nickname for the comprehensive environmental remediation liability, the comprehensive environmental remediation compensation and liability act. And that's a mouthful. So the nickname is Superfund. And it was added to that list in 1990, largely thanks to the advocacy of the Elam Indian Colony and the residents there who were so severely impacted by living in the shadow of the mine site. And actually also having the federal government bring mine waste into their community as a construction material, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 1970s. In addition, the mine has impacts on all of the users and wildlife of Clear Lake. And that's because the mine is an ongoing source of mercury into Clear Lake. And mercury doesn't represent a major water quality issue because of its nature. It tends to bind to solid particles, so it accumulates in the sediments of the lake. But beginning in the 1970s, mercury was found in the fish and wildlife in Clear Lake. And that was traced back to Sulphur Bank as the primary source. So EPA breaks up Superfund sites into what we call operable units. We chunk them up based usually on the nature of the contamination, based on the geographic considerations, in order to make the cleanup sort of make sense. So in this case, we've got 3 operable units. We've got OU1 is the mine site and the residential soils, the soil in the 2 residential communities nearest to the mine where mine waste was introduced. OU2, I'll try not to have too much of the government alphabet soup with all the acronyms, but OU is one I'll use a lot because it's stuck in my head. So OU is operable unit. OU2 is Clear Lake, and in particular the Oaks Arm, where the majority of the mercury from the mine is accumulated. But because of the really strong currents in Clear Lake and the fact fish move, the mercury from the mine is throughout Clear Lake. So really all of Clear Lake is part of that second operable unit. And then we go from OU2 to OU4. OU3 is an old designation that was pulled back into OU1 and isn't used anymore. So we jump from OU2 to OU4, and that's the wetland area to the north of the mine site, as well as this large study area to the east and south. All of those are lands that are intended to be transferred to the Elam tribe to expand their reservation land. And so we're including all of that as part of our study area to ensure basically that they're receiving clean land for their use. So zooming in on OU1, which is going to be the focus of a lot of the rest of the conversation because we lost it, but OU1 is the main mine site and residential properties. There we have 5 waste piles, we have 2 ore piles and a tailings pile. We also have a number of abandoned mine buildings that are associated with the mine operations. Mercury, arsenic, and antimony are primary contaminants that cause risk to human health on the mine site. We have about 2.5 million cubic yards of mine waste spread across the 160 acres of the 200-acre mine site. We also have the 23-acre open pit, which now, if anyone's been by the site, is completely flooded with primarily groundwater. That pit reaches a depth of about 90 feet. And the only thing that separates the pit, which is called permanent impoundment, as you can see from the figure, the only thing that separates permanent impoundment from Clear Lake is the waste rock dam. And it's not an engineered dam, it's just a waste pile. So as they were excavating material from the pit, they were just pushing waste directly into Clear Lake, and then it would collapse into the lake at the angle of the post. And so what remains there is the waste rock dam. Let me advance. So this is sort of a cartoon. We call it a conceptual site model that gives a sense of how the dynamics at the site work, how contamination at the site works, and where exposure occurs. So, of course, anyone who is directly interacting with mine waste has the potential to be exposed just due to that direct exposure, usually incidental ingestion. You get contaminated dust on your hands or on your food, and you end up eating it or inhaling it. In addition, mercury in particular, but other contaminants as well, are transported via stormwater, groundwater, wind, and gas release from the site, and then they're carried into Clear Lake. The EPA has taken a number of early actions at the site. They'll talk about it in a subsequent slide, such that the primary path for ongoing release of mercury from the site now is groundwater. So you can see the arrow there between Herman Impoundment and Clear Lake. Herman Impoundment's water level tends to sit about 10 feet above the water level of Clear Lake. That means that there's water pressure to push the water from the impoundment into the waste rock dam, where it becomes highly acidic, it picks up a heavy load of metals, and it carries those into Clear Lake. And again, because of the nature of mercury, it tends to bind to these solid particles, so it's not an active water quality issue. Mercury never represents a risk in terms of any of the drinking water intakes. They never exceed federal standards for mercury, but it accumulates in the sediments where it then is available for biological uptake, and then it goes up the food chain such that the biggest fish in Clear Lake tend to have the highest concentrations of mercury in their tissue. And whenever you then eat the fish from the lake, you are potentially impacted by that. That's why Clear Lake has the oldest and still active mercury fish consumption advisory in the state of California. Whenever I talk about this, I also want to mention that about half of the freshwater water bodies in California have similar mercury fish advisories. And so I think that Clear Lake sometimes gets an unfair, because there's this very visible source right on the shore of the lake, it really gets sort of an unfair reputation when the same problem exists in many water bodies. It absolutely is a problem that needs to be solved, but it's also not a problem that's unique to the Clear Lake system. I won't bog you down too much in our sort of process, the sort of bureaucracy behind it, but I just wanted to note that where we are in the different parts of the process for the cleanup of the site. So on screen is the Superfund remedial process. So for large, complex sites that end up on the Superfund list, they go through this process that has 5 main components. First, we sort of assess whether the extent of the problem, whether it needs to be listed. We then characterize the nature and extent of contamination and how we might address that contamination. We then select a cleanup. We then move into the cleanup phase where we're doing all the detailed engineering design work, and then actually, out there with the yellow iron, moving dirt, getting the cleanup performed. And then we go into this post-construction period. We reevaluate the protectiveness of the remedy every 5 years, with the intention being that this is going to be a permanent solution to the contamination at the site. And basically, once that is affirmed, the site is potentially eligible to be delisted from the Superfund list. So the mine site, we made our final decision, our final cleanup decision in November of last year for the cleanup of the mine site. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So we're now in this engineer design phase. I was out there yesterday, meeting with the tribe, meeting with engineers, talking about exactly what we're going to do where, starting with the residential part of the work. I'll talk about that in the next slides. And then for the Clear Lake part of the site and the North Wetlands, we're still in this characterization phase. We're evaluating where exactly is the contamination, how does the contamination move within this system, and so then what options are there to address the problem. And our partners at USGS are playing a big role in helping us better understand that for the Clear Lake part of this. I mentioned the early cleanup actions. EPA really tries to prioritize addressing the most urgent risks to the public as soon as possible. And with that in mind, we've taken 8 emergency cleanup actions, early cleanup actions at the site, 4 on the mine site itself to stabilize it. When it was first added to the Superfund list, the waste rock dam was literally at the angle of repose. It was a cliff that was actively eroding into the lake. So we cut the slope back, we stabilized that. We took a number of actions to reroute stormwater away from contaminated material, so as much clean stormwater could reach the lake as possible without becoming contaminated and being another pathway for release. On the Elam Tribal Reservation, we've also taken 3 emergency cleanup actions to limit direct exposure. As I mentioned, in the 1970s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs actually brought mine waste from the mine onto the Elam Indian colony as they were building roads and creating level ground to build homes. And that introduced a lot of contamination into that community. And so we went in to address that problem and that source of direct exposure. And then we took a similar action in the neighborhood south of the mine, which is where the former mine operations workers all lived. And again, unfortunately at the time, mine waste was a convenient construction material. And so that's how a lot of contamination was introduced into that area as well. So from evaluating what's the extent of the problem, we move into, okay, how can we remediate or address the problem? We did this twice at this site, and part of the reason for that was trying to find a comprehensive solution that would provide a permanent cleanup that also didn't require in perpetuity, investment by taxpayers. So the goal is always to have a system that is passive, that doesn't require millions of dollars every year forever to burden the public. And so over the course of these 2 feasibility studies, which this is our study of cleanup alternatives, we evaluated 9 general cleanup options, 25 cleanup technologies, basically ranging from do very little to excavate every bit of material and export it off-site to get rid of it. So ranging from $16 million to almost $900 million in today's dollars. And from that cleanup evaluation, we came to, in November of last year, working closely with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, the Central Valley Regional Water Board, the Elam Indian Colony and their representatives. We came to the selected OU1 cleanup, which is really a focus on source control. It's consolidate the exposed waste piles at the site. So the dark red shown are areas that we expect to be fully excavated and moved, consolidated onto other areas of waste. We would then cap those waste piles. The orange is areas that might be moved, depending on considerations that need to be further evaluated. We would then cap that with a cap similar to what they use on like landfills, where you have a heavy plastic liner and about 2 feet of growth media of clean soil on top of that. The goal here is to prevent water from interacting with the waste, because if you exclude water, you don't get leaching, you don't get transport, and you don't have direct exposure to the material because you have a cap with soil on top of it. Another part of the goal is we want to really redirect water away from Herman impoundment. As I mentioned, the water level of Herman impoundment sits above the level of Clear Lake. Every drop of water we can keep from going into Herman impoundment is a drop of water we keep from running through the waste rock dam, picking up contaminants, and going on into the lake. So that's sort of the overall strategy. The total estimated cleanup cost for this action is $94.5 million. There's pretty big error bars on that, up to a plus 50% cost above that. And the first $30 million of that has been secured through the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that has been actually granted and funded. It's in place. So we are rolling on this cleanup.
That's federal money?
That's federal money. That the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that Congress passed had a large set aside for Superfund cleanups. At the time when the legislation was passed, there was a lot of Superfund sites that were waiting to be funded. And so they set aside a large chunk of money to make that infrastructure investment, get these sites underway or cleaned up. So on screen here, there's a lot to read there, but just giving a general sense of the expected cleanup timeline. All of this is subject to change as we get into the engineering design, because obviously we want to implement this in a sequence that makes sense for the engineering. But preliminarily, this is the thinking. We definitely are going to start with a residential cleanup. We again are trying to address the most urgent risks first, and those are communities that are absolutely impacted by environmental justice related considerations. They're directly exposed on a day-to-day basis. They need to be handled first. Following that, we have 3 phases expected for the online work. The first year, in hopefully to start in 2026, is kind of the low-hanging fruit of reconfiguring the site, of getting things set up. Year 2 would be a major year of activity where we really move into the consolidation and capping work. And then year 3 would be basically all of the most complicated elements would be waited till we'd wait until as long as possible, so we have as much time as possible to do the engineering. Now, all of this is meant to be run parallel, so we are going to be doing design and build in parallel. So as we're implementing the residential work, we're doing the design for the residential now. As we're then implementing the residential, we're designing online phase 1. As we're implementing online phase 1, we're designing online phase 2. So the goal is that this can, once this starts, it's going to roll continuously, be completed in hopefully 4, maybe 5 years. And the residential work could start as soon as summer or fall of next year. We're working really closely with the Elam Indian Colony tribal government and the community to try to make that happen. Speaking of all the work that needs to happen in order for this to move forward, we're doing pretty extensive amount of pre-designed sampling work. There's a range of data that's needed in order to implement the remedy. We need higher density, greater resolution data on where exactly contamination is. I'll mention on the next slide, the National Historic Preservation Act. The Gila Median Colony is highly, highly sensitive in terms of archaeological and tribal cultural resources. And so we want to try to, at the same time, we want to try to provide a complete level of protectiveness while also minimizing the footprint of disturbance so that we're not disturbing more of those archaeological resources than is strictly necessary. So that means we need pretty high spatial density in our sampling to understand exactly where we must work and where we can avoid doing work. We also need things like LiDAR. We need chemical and geotechnical data across the site in a higher density. We need test pits to evaluate the depth of potential borrow soil. We need vegetation sampling, archaeological and tribal cultural resources data. We're also reevaluating our understanding of what concentrations of mercury, arsenic, and antimony would be natural to the site had the mine not been constructed. So the cleanup is to background for mercury and arsenic in particular. Basically, because the Elam community in particular is exposed to such a high dose of contamination from the mine site and the lake, looking cumulatively at those impacts, we need to lower those impacts as much as we can, and that means cleaning up to background. And our prior background study, there was some concern that it could have received windblown dust from the site, it could have been bias high. We're reevaluating that. It's looking like we're going to lower our cleanup levels even further, providing even greater protection for that community. I mentioned National Historic Preservation Act. We've been out on site doing surveys. This is not a map of where the sites are. This is just actually a map of where we surveyed. And we're coordinating that activity really closely with the Elam tribe. We're having monthly meetings with the community, meeting with the tribe's historic preservation officer on a regular basis, as well as representatives of the tribal government. A finding of adverse effect in terms of impacts on those resources is likely, so we're opening conversations about what might appropriate mitigation for those impacts look like. And this is sort of a good transition to the presentations that will come after me. Ongoing studies of the contamination as it moves from the site to the lake, then what happens, right? We are just now completing a more comprehensive study of the mercury transport from the site to the lake to establish a clearer baseline condition from which to evaluate how effective was our cleanup. We've got a network of wells across the site using that plus sophisticated groundwater flow model and geochemical modeling to evaluate exactly how much mercury goes from the site to the lake, so we can say, once we've implemented the cleanup, how successful were we? Did we accomplish what we set out to accomplish? And basically what these slides show is it more or less affirms that the strategy that I showed, which showed a large portion of waste rock dam being fully excavated, consolidated onto one of the other waste piles, completely remove it from the groundwater flow path between the pit and the lake. That is inappropriate, that is the appropriate action here in order to control the loading of mercury from the site to the lake. I mentioned that the other operable units are still in this nature extent evaluation. We're still studying the extent of the problem. USGS is a critical partner in that effort. They've been collecting data from across the lake. Charlie will talk about the phenomenal work they've been doing to define the extent of contamination in the lake, help us better understand how does mercury move within this system. Mercury is extremely complex in terms of how it is bioaccumulated, how it's transformed, and therefore what factors might be available to EPA to potentially interrupt that cycle and address the problem, which at its very end is really being exposed via consumption of fish. There have been prior evaluations that have basically looked at it very simply. If you have X concentration in the sediment, you have Y concentration in the fish. We know that's not accurate. And so we need to really evaluate all the variables that actually connect those two so that we can better understand how can we interrupt this cycle and address this problem. At the bottom there, I mentioned, and Sam mentioned it earlier, the hypomagnetic oxygenation pilot study. As Sam mentioned, the Blue Ribbon Committees, there's a budgetary challenge right now from the state, and they're looking for other ways to fulfill their the projects that there's interest in. A good example of that is this HOS pilot. It's looking like EPA is likely to fund that pilot. It has benefit for both addressing nutrient loading in the lake and potentially interrupting the transformation of total mercury into methylmercury, which is what then winds up in the food chain. And so USGS, the Blue Ribbon Committee, we're really trying to, I think USGS is really playing an important role in integrating these efforts between what the state's doing, what the federal government's doing, so that we can look at comprehensive solutions to the water quality challenges that Clear confronts. For more information, we've got a website, the URL's on screen, or you can contact me at the information on screen. I'll answer questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much.